Hi, I'm David Heilpern. I was a magistrate for 21 years, and a couple of years ago I stopped doing that, mostly because of silly drug driving laws, and now I'm here and I'm in practice as a lawyer, mostly doing drug driving work and trying to change those laws.
Excellent, thank you. We're so lucky to have you. And today you will be leading a discussion which is titled Cannabis and Driving. So please make your way up to the well, actually, maybe if you'd like to take the podium, that would be terrific. And you'll be joined today by the illustrious Ian McGregor. No? Okay, all right, maybe not.
Yeah, unfortunately, I've got to rush away, but Danielle McCartney, who's done a lot of the excellent work that I referred to in my talk around driving, has kindly agreed to be my stunt double, I guess you could call it that. But she's much more knowledgeable about this than I am. So thanks, Danielle, and thank you, everyone.
And thank you for your own. Well, actually, before you go, another round of applause, because I don't feel like you got a big round enough, because I didn't really, make a big deal of it. But here you are. You were exceptional today, as always, and you've been here right from the beginning. So yeah, terrific. Thank you. All right, so Danielle, if you could please make your way to the stage, that'd be terrific as well. And I think we're also joined. Now we've got, I think, one more person, and that would be Jenny, who's right behind me. Hello? Can we hear audio for Jenny?
Yes, Mella.
Yes, hello.
Can you hear me?
Hello, Jenny. Is it Jenny Paglis? Is that right? Is that how
Yes,
you say your last name? Wonderful.
that's correct.
Welcome. I'm going to hand the discussion over to David now. So take it away.
Thank you, Helen.
Greetings, everybody. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, David.
Great. And you can too, Jenny. So this is fairly laissez-faire, but I was going to speak for about 10 minutes and then invite other panel members to do the same, and certainly Jenny as well. I haven't met Jenny before, and I'm not exactly sure what she's going to say, but it'll be a mystery.
Thanks, Dave.
And then so we thought maximum 5 to 10 minutes each, and then really open it up for questions, comments and discussion. So I'm sure there's a roving mic for that to occur. Greetings. Thank you, Lucy, and the organising panel for having me here to speak, and with, of course, the panel. I acknowledge that I am on the land of First Nations people, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. 2 years ago, a bit over 2 years ago now, I was the magistrate at Lismore Local Court and Casino, Kyogle, which took into account Nimbin and a range of other towns, and about 50 cases a week of drug driving were coming before me. Most of those I would have no choice but to take away their licences. This, of course, has a significant impact on people in terms of their ability to drive, obviously, because they lose their licence, but also because they end up with a conviction, they end up not being able to be employed, they end up not being able to pay their mortgage, and I couldn't stand it, really. I'd seen a lot of stupid laws in my years on the bench and as a lawyer, but none as completely stupid as these. And in terms of this symposium, I'm a bit of the angel of death, really, because I can't see myself how there can be a viable medicinal cannabis industry, leaving aside CBD as an isolate, in circumstances where most doctors are telling their patients that if they take anything with THC as prescribed, then they are subject to drug driving detection laws. And I know from speaking to doctors, even prescribers here today, that a lot of their patients simply say, well, I can't do that. And they turn away and they go back to their barbiturates, they go back to their anti-anxiety or pain medication, they go back to their opioids, and they drive on the roads probably far more dangerously than they would have if they had taken their prescription. So one of the reasons I left was for this, and I joined a group of young, intelligent, budding activists at Drive Change, and I thought this would be a very short campaign, because what we were seeking to do was simply introduce the same laws on mainland Australia as exist in Tasmania, United Kingdom, Ireland, New Zealand, Canada, most of the United States, Turkey, you name it, which is that if you are on a prescription for cannabis and you are not driving under the influence, that is impaired, then you have a defence to a charge of driving with a detectable level of drug in your system, and that defence is, I have a prescription, I'm using in accordance with the prescription, go away and leave me alone. That is the law in Tasmania. That is the law in New South Wales with respect to other prescription drugs. There's no drug detectable laws with respect to the vast or any other prescription drugs in Australia. There is simply none. So it is only cannabis and it is other illicit drugs that are not prescribable that are subject to these drug detection laws. And it is a hangover. It's a hangover from when cannabis was unlawful. That's all it is. There's no logic to this whatsoever. And I greatly respect the work that Tom is doing and that the Lambert Institute has done. But really, this is just a silly law because it doesn't apply to any other prescription drug. It is a loss of freedom for those who happen to use a drug that once was illicit. And that is infuriating. So, if, of course, and leaving aside the research that's being done, if, of course, this was going to be a really major problem, you would expect to see a really major problem in Tasmania. You would expect to see a massive increase in the road toll because all these cannabis users who are on prescription would suddenly be raising this defence, and lo and behold, you know, the road toll would go crazy because, after all, the people who are objecting to any change say that this is dangerous, that we can't allow medicinal cannabis users on the road. We can't allow people who are using according to their prescription to drive because it will be dangerous. Well, there just is no evidence that the road toll or road trauma increases in those jurisdictions where they have no defence to these silly laws. Indeed, there is no evidence that these laws have reduced the road toll. When they introduced random breath testing, massive reduction in road trauma. When they introduced seatbelts, the same. 50-kilometre-an-hour speed limits, the same. Airbags, the same. Drug driving detection laws, no evidence that it's had any impact on road trauma anywhere. So I guess we have to ask ourselves, well, how big a problem is this? We saw the stats before of the number of prescriptions. There are a lot of people being prescribed. My individual experience was that a majority of those who were appearing before me charged with this offence were medicinal cannabis users. Not, I should say, all prescribers, but prescribed cannabis users, some illicit, but we just don't have any numbers. No one knows how many people getting caught by these laws are medicinal cannabis users. How many tests? Well, in New South Wales, 250,000 from this calendar year will be applied. 250,000 tests. Of those, they will get a positive strike rate of about 8%. 2/3 of those will be for cannabis. So what we're talking about around Australia is tens of thousands of people losing their licences every year. And of course, many more people not being able to use the medicine that they are being prescribed for fear of these laws impacting on their life. Who wins from this scenario? Because I can't understand why you would have these laws. It's clearly not about road safety, because if it was about road safety, it would apply to other drugs, other prescription drugs. It's clearly not about road safety because the worldwide evidence, well, there is no evidence that the road toll is being positively impacted by these laws. So who wins from this? Number one, the pharmaceutical companies win. Because most people, I saw all those conditions that the Lambert Institute doctors put up there earlier. Most people who are using medicinal cannabis are going to have been using pharmaceutical drugs to start with, and they'll go back to them. They'll go back to them even though the evidence is that those drugs have a greater impact on their driving. They'll go back to them, and so the pharmaceutical companies win. Who else wins? The alcohol industry wins. Because instead of having medicinal cannabis at night, people will have a couple of whiskies. This will become that obviously if people are able to use medicinal cannabis, studies show that alcohol decreases in their, people use less alcohol as an alternative. And the third people who gain are the police services themselves. The administration of 250,000 tests comes at a cost. It comes straight out of the road safety budget. That budget is meant for black spots and overtaking lanes and all sorts of things. Instead, on a per test basis, the police are paid from the road safety dollars to administer these tests. So the police budget is actually increased by the administration of these tests. When I say to police, why are you doing this? Why are you focusing on this non-road safety measure? The answer, of course, is the dollar signs that they make by the administration, by the application of the tests on a per test basis. So where do we go from here? Well, firstly, realise what's at stake. There cannot be a viable, financially viable medicinal cannabis industry if you are only administering cannabis or prescribing cannabis to those who don't drive. I just don't believe there's a big enough patient base for that to ever work in Australia. What else? So that's the first thing, is that recognition. Secondly, I think it's really important to paint a false dichotomy, to deal with a false dichotomy, be ready to argue this, and there's a lot of this on the Drive Change website. The false dichotomy is that medicinal cannabis use causes road trauma. That is, that people who are using in accordance with their prescription are responsible for deaths or injuries on the road. There is not one coronial finding that I can find throughout all of Australia that says a medicinal cannabis user was responsible for deaths. Also, the figures that are touted that say that maybe 10 or 15% of those road deaths, there is cannabis involved. What that means is that when they do a blood sample of deceased persons from road trauma, that in 10 to 15% they find some cannabis. The levels are way lower than detectable for offending, and they're from blood and hair samples, not from saliva. But, and here's the big but, nobody knows how many of those were medicinal cannabis users or recreational cannabis users, or what the situation was. Not only that, nobody knows if those individuals were the ones who caused the accident. Not only that, nobody's done studies on, well, if most people who die in road deaths are 18 to 25, what is the residual level of THC in all of that cohort system in any event? So the big furphy is that cannabis, medicinal cannabis use causes road trauma. And in my view, there is just no evidence to support that contention whatsoever. And in the absence of that, then the only reason we can have these laws is not for road safety measures, but for prohibition measures, for pharmaceutical companies' benefits, and for the alcohol industry's benefits. So, the other thing you can do about this is support the Drive Change campaign. None of us are making any money out of the Drive Change campaign. We are using this to try and lobby politicians and obtain and change the drug driving laws just so medicinal cannabis users have a defence, same as Tasmania. And I would strongly urge you to look at that website, to donate if you can, and particularly my plea is to industry. Unless these drug driving laws change, then the industry is going to be in dire straits. I just wanted to finish by telling a story. Just recently, I've been assisting a pharmacist who, lo and behold, has an anxiety problem, went to a doctor, got a prescription for CBD THC, found it absolutely brilliant, and has now been caught for drug driving. He got caught as a result of a minor motor vehicle collision that he was involved in. A couple of things there. Firstly, his insurance, it wasn't his fault, by the way, someone smashed into him. His insurance won't cover him, because he had THC in his system, that is illegal. And under some insurance policies, if you have any presence of an illegal drug, your insurance is void. Secondly, he's been charged with drug driving. His industry body has told him that if he is convicted, then he will certainly lose his ability to continue in his profession. There is a lot at stake here for people, a lot at stake, and these laws really need to change. I don't think we can afford to wait out the times that Tom was just talking about for studies to be done when the evidence is clear that these defences in those narrow circumstances, by the way, if you are driving and weaving all over the road and are clearly impaired, then of course you should still be charged, and would be under the Tasmanian laws and any of the other laws that I mentioned around the world. It is only places like us that have per se drug laws and no defence where people are caught in this appalling bind. So that was my short introductory rave. I might ask Jenny now to talk with us and tell us a bit about, where are you, Jenny?
Hello, David. Hello, all. Thank you for taking my call. I'm in Benalla, Northeast Victoria.
And what's your story?
It's a long one, so I've tried to keep the points. I'm a 60-year-old. I've just turned 60 recently. I have a dual autoimmune illness, one diagnosed at the extreme level 6 years ago, SLE. It's a systemic lupus erythematosus, but it affects every major organ from brain to kidney, liver, heart, everything, skin and central nervous system. My overlap syndrome, I'm 8 times over what would be the average normal person's limit, over 8, should be under 80, and I'm over 640. That brought up an MI2 overlap, which could be, they've got me now at the moment with dermatomyositis, which is necrosis of the muscles, incredibly painful. I also have a couple of bonus additions to that. Raynaud's phenomenon, I can't regulate my temperature in heat or cold, especially the extremities. I also have Sjogren's syndrome, and I have a bacterial infection that I've lived with for 30 years plus, which is part of my illness, and it's bacterial related, called hidradenitis suppurativa. That's also very unpleasant to deal with. I'm a positive person. I like to try and use my skills. My mum was a scientist. She died at 57 years old, which was 27 years ago on Thursday. Mum had breast cancer, first one in the family. She was the eldest child. I'm the eldest and only girl in our family of 7 children. My dad recently passed away. He had renal cancer. My maternal grandparents, her mum's dad, my pup, had leukemia, and my grandmother had a sclerosis, and psoriasis head to toe. So it is a genetic defect, I've been told. I had no idea we had any of this. I've been very active all my life. 6 years ago, at time of diagnosis, I was on a walking frame. I was on 32 different pills, morning and evening, sometimes more, sometimes less. And I was at the stage of whimpering. I've never done that in my life. I'm a pretty strong person. But I had nowhere to go. I was on opioids, benzos, everything they threw at me. Huge doses of pregabalin, which is, it gives you terrible side effects. I've come down to legally having a script. It took many years to get. I had to help my GP walk through the process with the TGA. Laura Walsh at the TGA was magnanimous, and she gave me authority to use her name. There was 32 steps involved to try and get onto medical cannabis because I just was not coping with this Western medicine. I have a pharmaceutical and a medical PA background, so I thought I'll use my powers and my brain and determination to try and help others because it is very, very difficult. And most people cannot be bothered. The amount of research I've done, scientific research, basis through Lancet, Johns Hopkins, UIC, they're all following, I'm following them. But the thing is, Dave and all, I'm one person and I can't thank you enough for caring enough to take this on. I live in the regions, as I mentioned. I'm on 0.5 mil of THC, 25 milligram per mil, less than 1.0 CBD. It's called T25. It's from Canatrek. I've tried a few different variations. The initial approval from TGA came through back in 2019. It was $300 for less than 50 mil. 0.5 of a mil was a game changer for me. I dropped all the drugs that I was on. I did become suicidal, which for me was just unheard of. I was on huge doses of Lyrica, which I stopped myself. I have since found out that was interacting with everything else they were giving me. My specialists, my rheumatologists, my GPs cannot believe that I've gone down to 2 Panadol Osteo at night and 0.5 of a mil of THC. Having said that, I have not been taking my THC. I've kept a diary. I've kept everything, the date, time, effects. It takes 10 minutes to 15 minutes, sublingually, 0.5 mil at night, last thing, and I'm out within 10 minutes. I wake up clear in the morning. I don't drive because I've imposed myself to do that, but I have been clearer than I was before I was taking all those other pills. I was completely, in retrospect, I shouldn't have been driving. Now, I'm very law-abiding, but I'm sick to death I've lobbied everybody, from Greg Hunt, who's recently retired, who helped me enormously, and he endorsed me back in 2017. I've got Lisa Neville sitting on her office desk at the moment, thanks to Steph Ryan, my state member, MP, where I've asked her, could you give me a time frame? Can we get a license to carry in our purse, like a COVID tick, a green tick, that if you find 0.5 mil, will it show up? And I want a time frame. I simply want a time frame so I can live what rest of my life I have without the incredible pain. But I cannot get that answer. That seems to be a typical story from most people. It's almost like a carbon copy. Where to from here? I would like to try and lobby as hard as I can. I've joined the Drive Change with David, you mentioned earlier. I'm happy to give whatever help I can. I have huge amounts of research, but they're not listening. I don't want to be put into the category of junkies and people that willingly go out, non-law-abiding people. It's not in my DNA. I'd like to be clear and say, right, I've done my bit, but I need to take this medication. The shelf life only lasts for 6 months, and $300, it's quite expensive. Most people can't afford it, and they say, oh, I've tried this, I've tried that. I want the pharmaceutical grade, TGA approved. I'm now approved at 2-year intervals. I have a script ready to fill out now for my next lot, but I don't want to fill that out until I finish my last lot of $300, which I've still got some, yet it's going out of date.
So would you drive now if you could?
I drive. I want to drive. I need to drive regionally, David. But once again, I'm very sensible. But I was simply asking for a time frame in my long email. Greg Hunt had my history as well as Helen Haynes was great federal. She endorsed me straight away. So it's my story's been out there, and it's been back to Daniel Andrews' state government and Jill Hennessy days. I emailed them back and only received a pro forma template, and also from Jacqueline Symes recently, Attorney General lawmaker. I can further that on to relevant people of yourself, etc. She basically sent me back a pro forma. I waited 3.5 months for that. My case is also in front of Lisa Neville. I don't hold my breath, the police minister for state. But this is a really big deal. I've had people that I know, they know me around Benalla. I've been here, since 65, the family has. But I've seen the trauma that people have been through. I've got people, I've been there myself. I've been on a walking frame. I'm doing everything I can to stay alive and lose the pain and stay focused. There's some days I walk sideways into walls through my illness deteriorating, obviously. The time of diagnosis I was given, the worst case scenario was 5 years. Well, I've beaten that almost by a year. It's in your head though. And then I could live a normal life within reason with this medicine, and it works.
Okay, thank you very much, Jenny. Thanks very much for your input. The situation is in Victoria was our great hope for change. It hasn't eventuated. South Australia has bills. New South Wales has an upper house inquiry currently into amending the drug driving laws to enable people like Jenny to drive while using medicinal cannabis. But I don't hold a lot of hope there. The ACT, one would have thought, given that they've actually legalised the growing of plants, that they might create a medicinal cannabis exemption for their drug driving laws, but alas, no. So this is where we're at, with no change on any mainland state, and murmurings from police in Tasmania that they want to, quote, conform with the mainland. I don't know your name. Danielle, are you ready? Tom's gone. Danielle.
All right. Well, I apologise in advance for my what will probably be a very rocky attempt to fill Ian's shoes. I think the fellow panelists have really covered all of the issues in a lot of detail and really thoroughly so far. So there's not too much more that I feel I have to add, other than to say maybe, I guess over at the Lambert Initiative, we're doing a lot of work to try and better understand how to navigate the world of THC and driving and other cannabinoids and driving and the drug testing and things like that. And, it's all been really, it's generated a lot of interest in the community. People are really keen to hear what we have to say and what we've found. And, it's really nice to see that support, but it's a shame to hear that, the legislation is what it is. There doesn't seem to be the same progress that's coming about in that area, I guess, so far. So I don't know that I have, is there anything else to cover? I think that's probably it. I'm happy to take any questions if there are any. Thank you.
Any questions from the floor? Yep. Thanks, Martin. Here we go. Alrighty.
Hi, it's Martin from Cannabis. Just a question really for David and all the panel really. Given what you said about the states not moving at all, and sounds like even in Tasmania might be going backwards, what's the strategy next? Is it to try and pick off one of the states in the hope that one goes and then there's a domino effect, or is it federal? Where are you going to go with this?
Federally, of course, we've just had a change of government, and I met personally with not this one, but the last shadow minister. One thing that is on the cards is, and I'm sure everyone would appreciate this, is medicinal cannabis being on the PBS. When I say it's on the cards, it has been spoken of favourably by the ALP over the years, and I know that Greg Hunt also spoke in support of that. My own view is that that's an important step at changing the drug driving laws, because you would see a flood of people, the numbers of people using medicinal cannabis would greatly increase.
Yes.
I think also once the availability of over-the-counter CBD, which of course is lawful now, but the trials have to be done, it has to get the approval. Once that occurs, and that is not CBD isolate, that has some THC in it. And no one's done tests as to whether that is going to trigger the 5 nanograms or less that the swipe assesses. Again, once you have those flood of cases, and I suspect people will test positive, some, after using CBD over the counter. So those two things are quite important. But yes, essentially it is to pick off state by state and try and get some sense from, for example, the ACT or from New South Wales as a result of this upper house inquiry. I'm not optimistic of change by any of those means. I also like some of the more guerrilla tactics that are being mooted. They include making assessments of the masking agents that make the testing ineffective. Now, there's a lot of, I don't think it's a politically correct term to say old wives' tales, but the tales that are coming through. I mean, people swear by some things as masking agents. I don't know the truth of them, but it'd be marvellous if the swipe tests were nullified.
Mm-hmm.
Coming.
Thanks for your help with the legislation, guys. This one's mainly for Tom. A few questions with regards to the studies you presented. Do they take into account the driving history of the participants?
Mm.
Like, were the test subjects, had they been driving for a particular period of time, or was that not accounted for?
Yeah, so for the two studies at the moment, pretty much every study that we've done before, people have to have a full driver's license, and there's often a requirement around the number of kilometres they're driving a year. For example, in the Netherlands one, I think they had to be driving at least 3,000 kilometres a year, and for a number of years as well.
Yeah.
So there's generally some requirement that they're, at least somewhat experienced drivers, and that they're not, they haven't got their bread peas last week, and it's sort of their first year of driving.
Yep. And with regards to the studies that are undertaken, in comparison to the previous studies on alcohol that were used to determine the 0.5 cutoff, how rigorous are the studies being done from cannabis, given that those studies were probably pretty old? So I'm imagining a lot of the data we're presenting with the newer studies probably use technology that's a lot more accurate. Is that a fair assumption?
I can't quite hear. Is it? Sorry, I apologise. But
So basically, the previous studies that were done on alcohol to determine the 0.5 limit as a safe standard for driving were likely done a long time ago. I assume that there's no need to repeat those studies. Are we doing studies on THC and CBD at the same caliber? Is there an issue with the legislation going forward because of the lack of quality of the study or the number of participation in the study, or do you feel that there is something else, such as, I don't know, stigma or that's holding back legislation?
We don't have anything like that same evidence base for THC from those sorts of observational studies that really establish that at 0.05, your crush risk is a lot higher. And there are some studies, this sort of a Grand Rapids study in Michigan and the US that and a number of studies around it that really clearly showed that, your crush risk is much higher at 0.05 and goes up exponentially after that. And we don't have that for THC. Crush risk estimates for THC vary really quite dramatically. That's why that 1.2 to 1.4 figure I presented before is just taken from a couple of recent meta-analyses that have really combined a whole lot of individual studies together. Because if you look at some of the individual studies one by one, some of the bigger studies have said there's no change at all in crash risk when you have THC in your system. Others suggest you have a 20-fold increase in crash risk. There's a huge amount of variability. Part of the issue with running those studies with cannabis compared to alcohol is that it's really tricky because there's no really good linear relationship between the amount of THC you have in your system and how impaired you are. The other thing is it's very hard to get consistent measures of THC concentrations from participants. With alcohol, you just use a breathalyzer. With THC, what often happens is that the people that are involved in crashes have blood samples taken, but to get the controls, you're sort of like, your roadside sample of people that aren't impaired, but to see what the population level of THC presence is like, they typically use oral fluid because it's much easier. You can't just sort of wave someone over at the side of the road and say, hey, do you want to be in this study? Okay, stick your hand out, we'll pop a needle in you. It's a lot harder. So you're often comparing different biological matrices, oral fluid compared to blood, which you can't really do because THC sticks around for a completely different amount of time in the two things. So there's sort of a couple of reasons why that evidence base isn't really there for THC in terms of those sort of observational studies that really kind of closely and really, I suppose, accurately classify crash risk. Does that answer that?
Completely, thank you.
Could I ask Tom a question, possibly? Hello, Tom.
Oh, sorry, yes, I was looking around.
Hello, Tom. Sorry,
Jenny, we were all wondering where that voice came from then. So.
Oh, well,
The sound here on the station, it
intrigued.
bounces around.
No, I'm intrigued. I just wanted to ask Tom, in conjunction with what David said earlier, if you've got a full driving record, as I said, I'm 60 years old. I barely had a speeding test once, I think, and I fought that and I won. Tom, swipe tests on the side of the road. If I have taken my medicinal cannabis 0.5 mil and waited, I normally self-impose up to 3 days, but I know I'm fine to drive the next day, yet I'm still hesitant because I'm law-abiding, which is not really relevant, but it is to me. Can they detect at all if you have 0.5 of a mil, judging from what the dosages you were giving earlier?
So you said you're taking 0.5 mil of a 25 milligram per mil product, so 12 and a half.
Sublingually, correct.
There's a pretty good chance that would show up as positive for a while. Yeah.
For a while, so
it's really hard to say how long. It's
No,
it's
I
really
understand
inconsistent for different people. I mean, I've seen cases where people have had a milligram or 2 milligrams of THC and they're still testing positive for a few hours afterwards. And then, on to the sort of other side, people that have taken quite a lot of THC and are testing negative within a couple of hours. So it's really hard to predict, and it really varies from person to person.
Yeah, I understand that. The difference is with this particular medication, as I mentioned, and then I can leave you be, it's a really big deal. This helps switch me into remission. It's to do with the ECS, endocannabinoid system. You'll know all about that. This plant, if you like, with all the properties where they're still studying, the CB1 and CB2, it was remarkable. As I said, I kept a full diary. My husband watched me as I took the 0.5. I started at 0.3, titrating up to 1.8. But I don't think I'll ever be on that. That's on my SAS Cat B, which I am currently. Palliative will go to A. So the negligible dose I'm taking is enough to switch this beast off. Now, I can be the colour of a traffic light. I have numb feet all the time. I have, this time of the year. But it's a remarkable drug, and for such a small quantity. And we're, once again, as David said, and I understand that fully, the pharmaceutical will be the big losers because I'm not taking 32 different types of opioids, benzos, etc., plus Valiums and God knows what. It's a big deal for people, and it's a natural plant. And my mother was offered this 27 years ago in palliative. She was terminal, and her oncologist at Ringwood Private was right onto it. Nothing changed. When I was diagnosed, I'd looked after my dad and my mother-in-law for 20 years while working and running my own business for 20 years. Then as a carer and then full-time carer before they died. Nothing changed, so I thought I'll take Andrews on. I will. I don't have a lot of time for the Premier Andrews, simply because he took this to the election in 2014, and since 27 years, nothing's changed. So one person can make a difference. You know, if you've got the facts and you deal with good people and you stick to your... I'm trying to help a lot of people as well. It's a really tough gig to do. The steps that were involved, as I said earlier with TGA, went from 32 steps to my GP, who's since retired.
Jenny,
Wonderful.
Jenny, I'm just going to interrupt you because I'd
Sure.
like to give Danielle a chance to answer your question
Yes.
about time frames. It's the question that I'm asked more than any other question. And maybe, Danielle, I think you were going to say something about how long between use and test, or is there simply no answer to that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think, is that on? Yeah, I think Tom covered it nicely in that, I think Tom covered it nicely in that to say that we really don't have good data around this, and it's difficult to answer because the few studies that we have done, we've completed one recently where participants were administered 10 milligrams of THC orally in oil in the evening before going to bed, and we tested them before bed and then the following morning. And I believe only a very small proportion of those participants actually produced a positive test within even the 30 minutes before bed. But, you know, one or two might have tested positive the next day here or there. It's really sporadic. And I guess it's a reflection of how, you know, cannabinoids don't necessarily, what would you say, they can do all kinds of funny things in saliva. They can they can accumulate, or they can wash out, and various different things. So sorry if that's a little bit unclear, but I guess even that data that we do have is all based on acute dosing. So a single dose the night before, and then waking up and doing a test the next day. To my knowledge, we don't have a lot of data around people who are using these things regularly, and I think that's what Tom's new study is starting to look at. So maybe we'll have a little bit more insights soon.
And I would just like to add to that, and that is my experience as a magistrate was that testing is completely erratic.
Yeah.
People can smoke, a whole group of people can smoke, they can all be tested, and only one will test positive, even though they all smoked at the same time. The longest that I found somebody could be affected was 9 days. Obviously, there are such variabilities between people's prior use. So, in other words, if people are heavy ongoing smokers, I presume they're much more likely, even if they haven't smoked for 24, 36 hours, to test positive. And I'm also acutely aware that those people who are on medicinal cannabis, mostly the prescriptions require them to take at least once in a 24-hour cycle, and often much more. And so what that means is that they are a driving time bomb as far as these laws are concerned, 24/7. So the answer that we at Drive Change give, and that I give, is who knows, really, is the short answer. If you're going to use medicinal cannabis, you cannot safely drive safely, I'll leave that bit to Tom. What I mean is you can't legally drive in the sense of not having a risk of being apprehended with all the serious and significant consequences that that brings. Mind you, you could use heroin, or you could use LSD, or you could take mushrooms. You could obviously, in all states now, you can euthanize, but you can't use cannabis medicinally and drive.
Thanks for the panel. Andrew Proudfoot over here. Thank you again for all of your work across the domains that you all have expertise in as a panel. I think it's fantastic. The question I have is to David. Have you had any luck in any advocacy or success with either retired chiefs of the various law societies and or fellow retired jurists in terms of their interest in getting on board with yourself around your campaign?
We did have Mick Palmer, who was due to be on this panel, ex-Federal Police Commissioner. Unfortunately, he was ill and he couldn't be here. Short answer is the Bar Association and the Law Society and the Law Institute in Victoria, and same in South Australia, all the lawyer bodies have supported our campaign. And in terms of the Victorian inquiry, they made submissions. New South Wales inquiry, they made submissions. South Australia, they have been lobbying. So we sort of have been rallying the troops of the legal profession, current and retired, for change. You know, we also have a world expert here in Lucy at how slow the law is to change in the face of overwhelming evidence. I mean, I can't remember the number of years it took from publicity to legal medicinal cannabis by prescription, but you know, it was bleedingly obvious to those of us who've been involved in this space for many years before the law caught up with it. So I think we're in the same space with drug driving. Lucy, how long was it? Years?
Well, actually, people used to say to me it's happening quite quickly. I think we went public in 2014. 2015, Dan passed away, and on the anniversary of his death, the laws changed. But the way it changed was, you know, a little bit ridiculous because they had no law, they had no regulation written at the time. So it was very political. It was a political move. And then we waited that 8 months until the legislation was written and the regulation, was written. So we had that holding period where we had to wait with bated breath to actually see what this law change meant. And I can remember at the time when that became apparent, so many of us looked at each other and shook our heads and said, this is never going to work. And, you know, there were many problems that were foreshadowed at that time and that have played out in the years since. So whilst the laws have changed, you know, I mean, that's why I continue to work in this space. There are so many people like Jenny that have issues and their access is affected because of a multitude of reasons. So, you know, we try and cover all of them at this conference, but there are just so many. You know, we could probably be here for a week talking about all the issues. So,
I think there's another question. Other questions or comments? The question was, do I think that the new government may take a different stance? These are state-based laws. There is very little the Commonwealth can do in this space. Certainly, they probably won't override territories if they change the law. That's one plus. The PBS, as I already mentioned, but in terms of the drug driving space, these are not federal provisions. They are state-by-state provisions, and they, except in that one respect with Tasmania, they mimic each other.
David,
so short answer is I don't think it will make a big difference.
I think one of the tactics that we could use there is when SASB applications started and there were so many interferences, I guess you'd say, you know, Jenny talked about that very long pathway to access. There was, you know, I mean, I had it printed up on this 2 metre long poster. It was so complicated, and really at that time it was because of all the state interference. So I lobbied hard for the New South Wales Premier to take that issue to COAG, which he did, and it was only after that that the states agreed to stop interfering, or at least some of them did. So that would be potentially something that we could do with this issue, because it is affecting access and it's affecting every state. So if we can get it on a COAG agenda at some stage in the not too distant future, that could possibly be a way of getting the states to come to some consensus in favour of the patient.
Certainly. Thanks for that, Lucy. And there's also the gentleman in blue again as well. Yep.
I was just going to suggest there is a limited constitutional power around transport at the federal level. Maybe we need to look at that angle as well in terms of, you know, the International Convention governs the threshold issue that brings it into our domestic
That's a complicated question, which requires only this answer. Let's communicate about that by email. Short answer is, of course, the best legal minds in the country have been focused on this. You know, we have currently got Greg Barnes, SC, acting in a test sort of case in Victoria. We have had advice, free advice from some of the leading constitutional lawyers in the country, all of whom we've dished up a series of ideas to, and they've poured cold water on. The law, unfortunately, is based around around a road safety mechanism, and it makes it almost impenetrable to legal challenge, regrettably.
So it's Martin from Cannabis again. I'm moving around the room just following the microphone. But so, David, given what you said about, you know, without change to this law, it's very difficult to see an industry growing at scale. It's that important. There's obviously a lot of companies next door exhibiting here. What more could they be doing? Because this is ultimately in their commercial interest to be supporting the campaign.
Look, I don't want to say that the only solution to this entire problem is drive change, because I'm sure there are other solutions. And for example, sponsoring the kind of research that's being done is an important industry measure. For myself, I think that proving that cannabis is safe, dangerous, risky, problematic, non-problematic is actually attacking the whole issue from the wrong end, because the alternative is people use pharmaceuticals, and on every piece of research they are at prescribed levels problematic. Alcohol up to 0.05 is still problematic, but we allow it. So even those studies, I appreciate that some of them are creeping over 0.05 at certain points of time in the studies with occasional users, but by and large, we're not actually looking at a really serious problem. So whilst the research is important, I think that the industry should be, and I can say obviously a significant proportion of the industry has been helpful to drive change, but if we had hundreds of thousands of dollars to fight this campaign and go and address each of the parliaments and put in submissions to all the parliamentary inquiries and lobby all the retired heads of jurisdiction and judges, if we had the space, time and money to support that sort of ongoing campaign, then I think we would be much more likely to be successful. As I say, you know, this is an industry that is starting to attract big bickies from big funders who obviously see it as a financially viable industry. I think they're kidding themselves while these drug driving laws are there. I really do. What's the point of putting $100 million into a company if the product cannot legally be used by 95% of the adult population? I mean, this is just like crazy.
Yeah. Dave, could I?
Yeah, I have a quick hello, David. I'm over here in the back of the room. Just to bring people up to speed, so David and I briefed the South Australian Parliament last year, in May last year, around a bill that was sponsored in the upper house by the Greens to give medicinal cannabis patients defence if they were caught with or roadside drug tested and THC was detected. From here, what we are progressing is a lot more work around education, and the work that Drive Change is doing is incredible. And yes, having a budget of enormous dollars would be helpful. But I would say, and what I say to a lot of people that I come across almost every week, sometimes daily, is that personal narratives are really powerful instruments of change. And those stories that you tell to your MP, to your GP, to your carer, and that are shared, doesn't cost a lot of money, and it doesn't take a lot of time to write a letter to your legislator or your local member at the state or federal level. I'm happy to help anyone, and I do this routinely, to connect with your local MPs, to connect with your federal members of parliament. What we saw yesterday is an incredible opportunity for change, and as what we're doing today, we're inspiring hope, we're exploring science, and we're also, with these personal narratives, can really dig at the heartstrings of our legislators. Just talking to John a minute ago, none of these changes will happen without our legislators coming on board. And one more closing remark, and this is on the back of the briefing that we did last year, David. So the Australian Lawyers Alliance now have one section of their program, their national conference in the Barossa in October, dedicated to unjust drug driving laws. So Greg will be presenting, and I'll be sharing some of Dr. Michael White's research as well. So we'd love to have your input, and Tom, I'll be in touch to talk about what that can look like. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much. I think we might have to wrap it up there, guys, because I think we're a little bit over time. So I'll throw it back to David.
Thank you so much for your participation and attention. And thanks very much to Tom and Danielle. Hopefully you can go away and start writing letters to your local members and your lobby groups so that we can achieve real change. So let's hope that by the time we meet here again next year, or is it the year after, that we'll be able to report that at least one state has fallen, because I think it's going to be a domino effect. I think as soon as one state has a medicinal defence, apart from Tasmania, which is like different, then others will follow. And Jenny, thank you very much for your participation. My recommendation is strongly that you move to Tasmania, because that way, or maybe Ireland or the United Kingdom or somewhere like that, because that way you will have a defence. So good luck with that, and but thanks so much for sharing your story.
Thank you all very much. I think the world of what you're doing, and thanks for caring.
Wonderful. Thanks to all of thanks, David, for leading this discussion. Thank you, Tom, Danielle, and Jenny. It's been a really powerful way to finish this incredible symposium. So round of applause again, and for yourselves for being here. Thank you so much for being an incredibly engaged and wonderful audience, and we look forward to doing it all again, don't we, Lucy? We sure do. But please, if there's anyone that wants to volunteer or has got any ideas around event organising, come and contact us. We need some help. So thank you so much. It's been fantastic, and I certainly feel really privileged to have been able to MC on behalf of Lucy. So thank you, and have a wonderful rest of the symposium. Yeah, travel safe.